All right, we're going to turn to a discussion of the draft RIPA report for the public. I believe there are copies outside. And for the board members, the report was sent to you via email, and it's also found in your folders. And so I thought it might make sense to open up for general comments about the framing of the report, and then we can go into particular sections, and we invite wordsmithing comments to happen via email by sending those directly back to Kelsey. So really thinking that our best use of our time right now is to think big picture about framing or about sections that are missing or should be added.
Yeah, just because our next board meeting is the teleconference one on December 10th, we're hoping to get like any red line edits, more specific edits by this Friday, giving you time to reflect on conversations had today if you have ways that you want to do it. But we would, by this Friday would be wonderful.
Okay, great.
And if the public as well
Yeah.
would like to comment.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's start with the board with some general framing, big picture comments. And Tim, I believe you had some, yes?
Yeah, and kind of piggybacking on what I was saying, I think others said, and others on this board will be more articulate than I am. But first of all, I want to, thank the staff for putting this together. I think it's by far the most interesting report that we've had to date, and actually starts to get to the heart of the matter. But to broad framing, I do think making clear, as we've been discussing today, and in responding to public comment, that we aren't under any misapprehension that the mere collection of data is what's going to end racial profiling. And perhaps the legislation was overly ambitious in saying that it was the job of the board to end racial profiling, but it's a good goal. But just collecting data and making that data transparent does not, in and of itself, address racial profiling or identity profiling. So I think making that clear, and that sort of sets the preface for why there's different recommendations then that talk to adopting policies, that talk to training, that talk to accountability. So I think making that very clear, and what we certainly know and have always known is that we are almost entirely dependent upon law enforcement to address this problem, right? Availability of data, transparency for the public doesn't address the problem. And that the individual law enforcement agencies will have the actual data that can point them to individual officers, as has been noted with early interventions and whatnot, that can point them to trends and problems within district stations or within divisions. So I think both that general framing, and then in terms of the recommendations, I think it starts to get towards that on page 15 and 16, where it's talking about kind of recommendations for supervisors. But if there would be a way to make that more muscular and maybe a bit bolder in terms of sort of pointing out from the chief and the command staff all the way down to the officer level, what are our recommendations? What are best practices at all of those levels for individual law enforcement agencies? And what ought be the expectations of the public in terms of the frequency and depth of the analysis, right? We heard from some departments today that they've been collecting data for 17 years but haven't decided to analyze it, which is a little disconcerting. And I don't mean to oversimplify what they said. So that would be my suggestion around strengthening the recommendations. And then the other piece that I was trying to sort of get to this morning, which is to make really clear that AB 953 and compliance with AB 953 is just the floor, not the ceiling. And that we want to encourage, to the end of combating and ending racial identity profiling, that the board wants to encourage the adoption of a whole range of policies and practices that will be elucidated by the data. But as folks have said repeatedly, and not just here in public comment, but again and again and again, they don't need to wait for the data to be told that there's racial profiling from their law enforcement agencies. So I think we could make some specific and bold recommendations in terms of expectations or steps way beyond the mere minimum duty of complying with AB 953 that would actually get to the heart of the matter.
Thanks, Tim. Very well said. Other comments, either on what Tim said? Or
Yeah, I was thinking that perhaps we could have a summary of the analysis at some point, once we get the data in, that there be some type of summary, because I don't know if the public's going to have the attention span to go through the entire report page by page. If we could have some type of summary of the data, some type of conclusion that the public could read, maybe with some bullet points to indicate the highlights of the report. Then if they want to get into the weeds of the report, they can, and they'll have some more incentive to get into the weeds, knowing that there's something up front that tells them what's inside of it.
So Doug, this report won't include any analysis of data, but it does talk about future reports, looks to future reporting. So is this something that you would want to embed into our description of what future reports would be?
Right, something.
Okay.
Once there's an analysis of the
Yeah.
data, then have it laid out so that the public can easily ascertain what's in it.
Okay, great. Yes.
Yeah, thanks. It has really been a pleasure to serve on the board since its inception and to listen to and hear from persons making public comment and from the various law enforcement agencies across the state, and following what seemed to be kind of a trend from one county to the next county, one city to the next city, as it relates to the level of pain, mistrust, distrust, and trustworthiness and lack of trustworthiness that we've seen and heard voice, and persons draw their own conclusions based upon the statements that they hear. But just to be a part of that, I think has been educational for me, and I'm hoping that it's been for everybody else too. But it's a labor of love that brings me to the meetings when we gather together as a board. I have a number of things that have to be pushed to the side just to give me enough time to be present. And it doesn't mean that those things that are pushed to the side no longer have to be addressed. It simply means they get pushed to another location, another time. So my schedule gets intensified, and I'm certain that everybody around this table, their schedules are somewhat similar to mine. But I think inherent in every collection of data, there's something that drives the collection of data. There's a perception of imbalance, irresponsibility, or something that drives the whole concept of collecting data together. And once the data is collected, it's analyzed. And I don't think there's a data collection, a data analysis that does not require some recommendation, some force of recommendation, what comes out of the data and its analysis by way of recommendation for improvement, for change, how law enforcement departments do hiring, how they do training, how they do up-to-date training, how they do improvements, how they do staffing, how they do discipline. All these matters are all important. And I think the data, the collection of data is going to do a lot to do that. It probably will be inhibited to some extent because of the lack of matters that some would have insisted be involved in the data collecting process. We've heard it from the public that it's going to be hard to make a case for racial profiling if you really don't get a sense of where the profiling comes from, whether it's actually driven by a particular ethnicity within a department. It'll be hard and difficult to understand how the response or how the stop was actually motivated, why it was motivated, why it was done without these. But there are other areas we can get to the problem of it. So I'm hoping, as Tim said, we can look to understand that the Assembly for the state of California intended us to do a little bit more than just collect data, but to let the data lead us someplace, and to be brave and bold enough to make some real recommendations that are going to change things to a point that the pathology that we see going on now will come to an end, and we'll move then, I think, to a better place. So I'm hoping after the data has been given to the analysis team that will be doing the analysis, we'll get it back with somewhere along the line there will be a chance for us to participate in some recommendations that can benefit from the exposure that we've had these last 3 years, and helping to make some conclusions on what could be best done, or better done, for law enforcement officials and for departments and for the general public at large. So, thanks.
Can I just piggyback real quick on that, because you had a point, and this is, I'm sure, a controversial recommendation, but I would suggest a recommendation that encourages departments, and I'm thinking about the large departments, to actually provide to the public that racial, gender, other years of service information that basically, against my better judgment, it was decided to scrub all of that from the data that's provided. And I understand the individual officer concerns for a smaller department. But if you're LAPD, providing that information couldn't possibly point a person to a specific officer. So I would hope that we could recommend that at least for the larger departments, larger cities and larger sheriff's departments, that they consider providing that level of detail for their own public to understand the answer to those questions that otherwise we have sort of whitewashed for the rest of the state.
Mm-hmm. So what I hear you saying, Tim, is that a proposal to include best practices for agencies to go above and beyond AB 953. And so that's probably worth a discussion to see where people are at on that, if that's something that people are willing to consider right now. And so welcome other thoughts around that.
Yeah, I'll just weigh in to say that I think it would be a important recommendation for us to put as a board to local agencies, really encouraging them to take this data. I know we're not wordsmithing, but I love the phrase of this idea of it being a floor and not a ceiling. And how do we, make recommendations to departments that AB 953 and its implementation is really the beginning or the continuing of existing culture change inside departments. And I think it would really serve what we've heard from the community, both here in public comment and those of us that are more engaged in the community, for us to make that strong recommendation, putting the onus on local departments to be responsive to the voice of the people.
Mm-hmm. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I completely agree with that recommendation too, and I think it's definitely what we've been hearing from the community, and if we're going to meet our stated goal to, I know it's somewhat lofty, and racial profiling, I think this needs to be, we need to emphasize that this isn't the ceiling. And one thing that I heard from San Diego in particular was the fact that they're giving away the data through PRAs in such a transparent fashion. I've sent PRAs to public agencies, and it's usually a nightmare. And there's litigation and meeting and conferring, and I think that is something that that sort of spirit should be emphasized in the report about how transparency is so critical for agencies who are really taking this seriously. And also the idea of even having town halls over the data, giving some suggestions about how to make this data useful to the community and build that trust. So I completely agree. I think it's one way for us to put more teeth in the report as well. So I think that's a great idea.
Remind the board that in the regulations in section regarding reporting requirements 999.227A2, that the data elements described are considered a minimum reporting agency shall collect and report. Nothing in this section prohibits a reporting agency from voluntarily collecting additional data. So that was made clear in our regulations.
I think just lifting that up even
Yeah,
more
exactly.
would be great.
I'm just saying that there is
Yeah.
regulatory support for your
Yeah.
position.
Yeah, absolutely.
So,
Are the regulations silent as to the publication of data? Because that I think we're talking about, of course, departments can collect all the data that they want beyond AB 953, but we're talking about what gets reported, because the regulations, really do scrub the data, because there's no gender information, there's no race information, there's no age information. A lot of the information that I think is critical for the public in understanding what's driving the racial profiling that they are experiencing is not going to be available. And I understood the rationale for that in terms of protecting individual officers, but going back to my point before, I just can't imagine why that rationale holds for a very large department.
So the statute itself, 12525.5D, prohibits the dissemination of any unique identifying information of an officer. So the Department of Justice cannot provide that information under
No,
Public
I'm
Records
sorry,
Act.
sorry to interrupt you. I'm not suggesting individual, I'm talking about aggregate, right? So if you've got LAPD and 10,000 complaints of racial and identity profiling in a given year, having aggregate information about those characteristics of all of the officers together who may have committed some of those offenses. And that's just citizen complaints. But what gets elucidated by the collection of the data, tell me if I'm wrong, that there's nothing in the legislation or the regulations that would prevent a large department from providing that aggregate data and making their own determination about making sure that it's not going to point to an individual officer who could face, be in peril because that information is out there.
Right.
So department of 5 people, I totally understand. If there's only one woman and you say, 17 complaints were generated by a female officer, then everybody knows who you're talking about. But when you've got massive law enforcement agencies, I just don't understand that problem.
No, I think that was my original point, that agencies are free to collect whatever data they want
And disseminate.
and disseminate it so long as it cannot re-identify the officer, I believe.
all right, so I think what we're talking about is perhaps a preface statement about the spirit of the legislation and how ultimately that this is a floor, not a ceiling, and that as a board, we encourage local agencies to use the data that they're collecting and any additional data that is needed in order to identify and address these issues at the local level, not wait for us at the state level, and not limit themselves to what is prescribed in the regulations, right? Some sort of opening statement to that effect, I think, might get at what we're talking about, because ultimately, we don't have any authority over what local agencies do. The legislation doesn't speak to it other than, providing that this is just a minimum. There's nothing that prevents them from doing more. Getting at the spirit of it, and I don't know if that is going to get us closer to where you're suggesting we go.
Yeah, I might even consider a set of recommendations for the consideration of local city councils and county boards of supervisors, because they do have oversight and control over their law enforcement agencies. Then you also have statewide, like CHP, but most agencies we're talking about do have to respond to their local elected officials.
Well, and then it creates an opportunity for local communities, if we send this message from the RIPA board, for local communities to then take that conversation to their local departments and say, these are the recommendations made to the Attorney General. So it creates opportunities for the public to say to the Attorney General, what's the way in which you are going to be looking to implement this? To say to local departments, if these are the best recommendations, why are you or are you not going to implement this? So I think one of the things that I feel like we've been hearing a lot from the public over the last, couple years has been, you all do something from this platform. So there was a comment I made a few meetings back around, we don't really have any teeth, but we can get the sharpest gums that we can possibly create. So I think this might be a way that we could create the conditions for community to more effectively lobby, organize, advocate for themselves by us creating conditions for them to speak to rather than them feeling alone, in their own spaces.
And just so I understand, is the suggestion to create more robust recommendations for city councils and supervisors around each of the different subcommittees? Okay, that makes sense.
I mean, the one thing that strikes me that I'm thinking through is that beyond making some more general recommendations, there may be, reasons to wait until we start seeing some of this data. Because I would imagine, as we were discussing, that once we start seeing this data, and if we start seeing, some unusual, disparities, and that we can dive a little deeper in thinking about what, now to do something with this data, and what recommendations we have to either help flesh out the data and to see what's going on, or if we think that there seems to be certain areas where there do seem to be problems, to then that will inform additional recommendations. And they may be recommendations for just the larger agencies at first. So part of me is thinking that, there may be an argument of not going too deep into recommendations until at least we see the first wave of data.
Well, there's a role for local city councils, supervisors, local residents to play now in holding their local law enforcement accountable or engaging with them in conversation about implementation. And so I would make a friendly amendment to Tim's proposal, which would be to not separate these things out and scatter them throughout the report, but actually to create just, a paragraph or two up front and say, this is the spirit of what AB 953 was going to do. Here's how you can act now, even in advance of the data, to play a role in successful implementation of the spirit and the letter of AB 953, and exercise accountability at the local level, right? Create the conditions, identify the places and the roles and the spaces where people or city council members or supervisors or citizen review boards can do their part.
I take that as a friendly amendment for the framing, but I still think that we can help make the specific recommendations more muscular. And that's why I was saying that, really getting to, and, the great advantage of this board is that we have this wealth of expertise from law enforcement on the board to help to identify and say, okay, so if you're a chief, what does this mean? If you're command staff, what does this mean? If you're a division supervisor, what does this mean? And I don't know, and maybe to Angela's point, we may have to see some data before we start making recommendations on the frequency or the depth of analysis of the data. But I think that's a whole other thing that sort of got elevated today, was departments with years and years of data who've never analyzed it. Well, at some point, we should probably have a recommendation, like every year you ought to analyze the data. And these are some of the questions that a thoughtful department would ask. But I think I defer to the folks in law enforcement, I think, and that's why it's great to have, for a whole variety of reasons, have them on the board, but largely because law enforcement is the one with the onus of implementing all this. But to maybe not wordsmith today, but help us think through what might be a set of recommendations for best practices, even, as we're saying, even towards ending racial and identity profiling, even if the data isn't rolling in yet in your department.
Brian?
Yeah, just to add to that, I think when it comes to the analyzation of the data in the larger departments, they have the ability to hire those people and look for those folks. I think, may not for this report, but for next year, we should probably try to engage some of those third-party vendors that are around the United States. I know New York University has a great program getting those folks to come here, because when this gets down to the lower level, the smaller agencies, they don't necessarily have the resources the larger groups have. So it might be incumbent upon this board to look at those researchers and say, hey, if you're looking for somebody to analyze that data at the lower levels, we've vetted some folks here that would be a good recommendation to use them. They're well-known, their data stands up to the scrutiny out there, and we can supply that type of information to these groups. And even some of the larger agencies, like my department, we used SDSU, and there was a lot of controversy regarding that report. But there are other, like Stanford has one, and like I said, New York, and we could actually engage those folks to be able to offer those services to the other agencies, or have the DOJ offer that services to those agencies.
I just wanted to make a quick recommendation with regard to what Andrea had suggested. If board members have suggested language that they would like to see in the intro, you could send it my way, or we can draft that, and then it should be presented to the whole board to give them opportunity to review and provide feedback on. And so anyone who has suggested language, just feel free to send it to me.
Yeah, thank you, Kelsey. Would love to hear from other law enforcement folks on the idea of next level recommendations, as Tim is suggesting, in each of these sections on what supervisors could be doing, or any other suggestions you have.
Yeah, we're having trouble hearing down.
Oh, okay. So Tim has suggested, and Sarah has suggested, that in the recommendations in the report, that we consider sort of adding to those bullet points something that specifically addresses what local agencies, local law enforcement agencies can do, or local government can do. And just, Tim has invited your thoughts on that, wanting to know what you think about that. Brian, in addition, has added some thoughts around third-party vendors, and we'd love to hear your voices.
Can you hear me? I think, it was mentioned earlier, I think the analysis of the data, the concern I know a number of us have, how is it going to be done, who's going to do it? And somebody brought up something that very, very important this morning. It should be done consistently, because you're going to have all these different, right now you have 8, and then you're going to have the second wave coming on in January. The analysis should be done consistently. Who's going to do it? How is it going to be interpreted? And then the other part of it is, and I know somebody mentioned companies that do this, it's going to be very, very expensive. And where is that money going to come from? From some of the local agencies, and even a big agency like mine, that still is a heavy lift when budgets are already tight. But I do agree with what has been said, that there should be a very thorough analysis, and to try and figure out, hey, is what we're doing working?
One thing that I was thinking about, and hearing some of the comments from law enforcement, is, I know at some point we're going to be talking about legislative recommendations. Could there be a recommendation for funding to be allocated to data analysis? Especially for smaller scale agencies, I would actually want to see even more data analysis, especially for these agencies that don't have the resources, haven't been subject to the same, perhaps, consent decrees in the past. So is that something we can consider?
Hi, I'm Dr. Randy Chance. I serve as the director of the Research Center at the Department of Justice. I just wanted to add that the Research Center received positions to support the work that's being done here. So over the next, you'll kind of see a glimpse of what we're planning to do in the future, but we serve as your analytical arm. And so we, as the Department of Justice, are happy to take on that work. That's sort of the role that Kevin's up here, and we've got staff in the audience. That's kind of their job. And so please feel free to engage with them on those concerns, because we're happy to do that work.
So an agency could reach out to DOJ and say, can you analyze my data?
So really, it's the board. So as these agencies begin to report, The research team will be analyzing that data on an agency level and reporting it back to you all for, hopefully to go into your reports, but it may go into other forums as well.
Okay.
Okay, so we're talking a little bit about oranges and apples here, and I want to focus us. So we have a set of recommendations. We've heard from the public. We've heard from the dais about data analysis, the importance of making sure that it's done in a standardized, uniform way, and that there's sufficient capacity to do it. We have a research arm that's going to be able to analyze the data, right? So that's one bucket. The other bucket that we've talked about is recommending to agencies that they go above and beyond the requirements in ABU 953 to embrace the spirit of the legislation and to do more, right? And so we welcome comment on that. Thank you. We welcome comment on that, which is the recommendation that Tim and Sarah have made.
As a chief of a smaller department, I appreciate some of the comments and acknowledgments that were made about scalability as it relates to department size, and I think about what the workload might mean for my team, some of the recommendations and the like. So I'm also left with a question, still trying to seek to understand. I think it was my colleague Tim down there who mentioned, well, what does this mean? And I'm trying to understand that as well. What do the recommendations mean from this body so far, from what I've heard, because I haven't found that to resonate yet. And I really think that if we had the information, the data to analyze after the first 8 agencies report, that would certainly enrich our conversation. And it would give us tangible information to look at and talk about and understand to help inform our recommendations, so that we're making recommendations based on data and not based on, just based on data. So I'll leave it at that. I think that we need to really flesh out what this means before we bring forward recommendations and understand what those are and the implications for even smaller agencies who represent most of the municipalities in California.
What did you think of my suggestion that we make a recommendation pointed really at the largest agencies, which I guess are phase 1 agencies, that obviously consistent with officer safety, that they do, at a minimum, that they internally analyze, because that's, by the time the data gets to DOJ, all the officer demographics are gone, right? So that at a minimum, if I were chief of police, I would want to have that data included in my internal analysis and information, and that, again, consistent with officer safety, the large department make as much of that available to the public in the aggregate as they can.
We are still, just to be clear, we're still collecting years of experience, type of assignment. We also will have the officer ID number. We are not disclosing that to the public, but we will be able to analyze within DOJ at the officer level.
Analyze what?
All of the data. So you could say, I want to look at stops for Officer A in this department, and you can look, we will be able, so our CJIS folks will be able to run those kinds of analyses for the board. They're just not available to the public.
And we'll know that Officer A had so many years of experience.
Yes.
Right.
But we won't know their gender, age, or ethnicity?
Correct. But we will know their type of assignment and years of experience.
So the question, as I understood it, just want to make sure, was would I support encouraging large agencies to provide that information or to look at that information? Is that?
Yep. Well, A, just to look at it themselves, right, to do that analysis, and presumably they do have the capacity as large agencies. And then B, again, as I said, consistent with officer safety, to be as transparent as possible with the public about sort of baseline and then trends going forward.
I think what I heard earlier was there are some agencies, San Diego comes to mind, maybe LA Sheriff's Department as well, that are providing that information currently to the public in some way, shape, or form. Is that accurate?
Yeah, there was anybody who does a PRA.
Right, so some agencies do it, some agencies don't, and the proposal is whether we should include best practices or recommendations for agencies to do these things. I want to infuse a practical concern, which is we don't have much time today, and then we don't have much time before we do a final sign-off on this report. We've been able to get the best practices into this report on the sections that we have so far because of the research that DOJ has done. I'm a little worried about the shortness of time that we have to add that in and be responsible about it for recommendations. I welcome others' thoughts. So I do think that the framing language could be put in with the intention that we've discussed without putting in the recommendations, just because I don't know that we could do that in a thorough and responsible way, in a way that's parallel to what we've done in the other sections, given the shortness of time. I welcome other thoughts about how we can handle the proposals that are on the table.
Can I just ask a question? Is the research arm of the DOJ going to make public the research as part of the later reports? And shouldn't we say that if it is in this current report, that there will be an analysis of the data that we receive? It will be broken down by department, and it will be made public as it comes in. We are encouraging agencies that are already collecting that information to do the same now. Is that basically capturing what?
So there is a section in the current report that does outline a couple of options that the board is considering for future reports. We'll start with wave one, so those first agencies will be analyzed in the next report. And then the thought is that as more agencies begin to roll into implementation, that data would also be analyzed for each of these reports as they move forward. But it's on behalf of the board. The Research Center doesn't serve as like an external consultant to law enforcement agencies, at least not at this point. But the board each year is responsible for analyzing that data, and that's what the Research Center is doing.
Okay.
Is that sufficient? I'm not sure if I answered the question.
Yeah, I mean, I just, in a little more concrete term, how is the analysis going to take place? I mean, are you going to say, you know, LA Police Department made X number of stops, and the percentage of them were African-American men, and X number of those stops did not involve any criminal activity? Is it going to be that kind of breakdown?
So, go ahead, Kevin. I'll let Kevin.
Okay, great. There's a section in the report, actually, that deals with talking about some of the specifics as far as the planned analyses. At this point, begins on page 53, and it goes through page 58. And it goes over some specific methodologies that will be employed, as well as talks about how there are other ones that are also going to be employed as well. And those can be applied either one, at the state level, because we're required to report on the status of racial profiling and related issues in the state of California, but also they could also then be applied to specific agencies and could be parsed out that way as well.
Our goal is to have a standard methodology for how the data is analyzed and for us to be able to replicate that over time as agencies begin to implement and submit data to us. With the thought that, you know, we might analyze data 1 year in one way, and we may choose to add to that analysis as we have capacity, but standard across those agencies.
Okay.
So in our reports, we won't be employing one method for Riverside Sheriff's Office and another for Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department. It'll be the same type of analysis applied both statewide and then parsed out by agency so that they're comparable as far as the methodology that's used.
Yeah, I think that's helpful to know, and I think, you know, maybe making sure that that's clearly stated. I know it's buried here and on page 50, but making sure it's up in the executive summary would be a good idea to make clear what the analysis the level of analysis will be, it will be statewide aggregate. It would also be agency specific. I think what Tim is bringing up is different. It's about going above and beyond the data that's collected or the information presented and shared with the public, right? So thank you for that.
So far as the construction of the report, I mean, and that was my take when I went through it, is I think we should move up that section on stop data. I mean, we are about the major import of RIPA is the collection of stop data and the identity of the people that are stopped. And I think the report reads better if that stop data section is somewhere before all of the other sections, perhaps right after the introduction.
How do other folks feel about that? I'm seeing nodding of heads. That makes sense to me. Move it further up, because that seems to be the bulk of the questions that we're getting from the public.
So as a way to kind of get at both concerns, to just include paragraphs that encourage, one, the data be made available as it's collected, two, that any methodology or analysis that's being done of the data be transparent, and three, that agencies share as much as possible about the officer makeup of, and maybe host town halls about, and community concerns. Is that sort of like the big picture stuff that we might want to include? Because that doesn't seem as unwieldy, but maybe having specific above and beyond recommendations for each subcommittee before the report is due probably is not feasible. Is that sort of what you were thinking in terms of the paragraphs?
Yeah, I think that's good.
Okay.
I do think some input from, not necessarily, do we have to figure it all out today, but from the folks in law enforcement, right? Do we have thoughtful people who care about this problem? So understanding from a chief's perspective, okay, you know what's going to be collected, you know what you'll have available. Put aside what will be made available to the public or to DOJ. How would you want to use it? How would you want to analyze it? How often do you want to analyze it? How do you want to kind of look at it for trends? Especially, you know, thinking about a larger department, smaller department, you probably know every one of your officers, but in a large department, you know, if you're serious about taking on this issue, right, we always say you can't manage what you can't measure. So now you have the measures. How would you use them? I'm not posing the question today, but I think getting to that and really encouraging that to happen, both voluntarily by, you know, from police leadership, but also educating the public and communities about, well, this is what you ought to be asking your police leadership to do, or asking your city council to ask your police leadership to do. This is sort of the expectations towards the goal of ending. So there's a whole there's a going above and beyond in terms of what you collect. I don't know, but we're already asking for a lot of collection. Mm-hmm. But I'd be more interested in going above and beyond in terms of what could be shared with the public and other policymakers and elected officials within a jurisdiction. And then the real question, right, to me is, as we've all been saying, data to what end, right? Like how, at a minimum, to have a recommendation on how often the data ought to be analyzed. And to begin, and maybe it's premature in this report, but begin to flesh out what are some key questions that a chief ought to be asking looking at this data.
So given the shortness of time, because we only have a few weeks before we need to sign off on a report like this, I think these are good building blocks for either a future report, annual report, or perhaps even an interim report, because we'll know a lot more going into next year, right? And so, you know, because we would need the expertise of law enforcement, would need their time, we would need to ground the best practices in something, as we've done throughout the report with citations and that sort of thing. So perhaps we could table the concrete recommendations for a future interim or annual report, and we could talk about it conceptually or in terms of framing language about how the way we've already expressed it.
And the other, and you know, I'm sure DOJ is in touch, but I would imagine that, you know, IACP and some of that, lots of police chiefs have been having these conversations, right? And coming up with sets of recommendations and best practices and whatnot. I can't imagine there's a police chief in the state who doesn't want to end any kind of bias within their police department. So there's got to be some thoughtful ideas out there.
And I will note that the best practices were built out of looking at recommendations from organizations like that. So the best practices that are included are ones that have been identified across several organizations that have collected these existing best practices, and so that is built into the best practices.
And they're good, and I really like what's here. I have no critique, and it's, like I said, so much more interesting and stronger than what we've had before. So I think I'm just pointing out some other areas, and if there isn't time to do them in this report, we'll do them in a future report.
Okay. Okay, so we've covered that ground. Are there other general comments or reflections on framing?
I have just one comment regarding in the report, you talk about the overview of data examined under it's on page 28. Page 20. Where they do the analysis of the complaints, and they talk about exoneration, sustained, not sustained. I think it would be helpful if there'd be a definition of those terms in the report so that people who may not know what exonerated and unfounded means. I think those definitions are readily available.
I think on page 18, there's a definition of key terms.
Okay, good.
So maybe we could just reference back to them.
Well, good. I'll withdraw that now.
Okay, all right.
Read the report.
You ask and you shall receive.
All right. Good job.
Okay. Other thoughts?
I have one that was from our prior meeting, I think in San Jose, when Mr. Sinagwe spoke with our group, or probably Dr. Sinagwe. And there was a question that my colleague Brian Marvel had about the data set and the size of the sample, and was it validated? And I don't know, maybe Brian can comment on that, if you ever heard back on the data set that was presented.
Actually, before he left, I gave him my business card and I asked him to reach out and contact me. I was hoping to get the raw data to analyze the information that he had provided the board, just to verify its veracity. I just wasn't sure if any of it was peer reviewed and we were just taking it based off of his single analysis, because I'm trying to marry it up to my department and the things that we do, and the statistics wouldn't have applied at all with my agency, especially when it came to the neck restraint. The neck restraint. Broad restraint.
One quick comment. We talked about it previously in regards to funding, proposed that their funding had been cut. And in reading this, I don't think it really stands out that we mentioned that. And we had talked about at the last meeting, making sure that was up front, that we talked about that. Supposed to be provided the funding to develop all this additional training.
And that was agendized to discuss today. That was something that was discussed, that was asked to be put on the, specifically agendized for this meeting at the last meeting in Davis.
Can you repeat the question?
Yeah, so it is on the agenda as a point of discussion.
Yeah, I just want to make sure that we get it in the, because we
Yeah.
had talked about it, and it wasn't really spelled out in the draft. So I just
Okay.
Yeah,
wanna make
in the
sure
I wanted to wait to reflect on the conversation that was going to be happening at this meeting.
Right,
to include-
okay. So maybe we could table that just briefly to see if there are any other comments, general comments around the draft. General or specific comments, wordsmithing comments you can send to Kelsey.
I had a question about dissemination of the report. Does it go to all of the mayors and city administrators in the state?
So Kelsey or Nancy, Tim asked about the dissemination of the report. Does it go to the mayors and?
Does it go to all of the mayors and city administrators in the state?
We'll be sending it out to all of our networks, and like I mentioned earlier, we're going to be having a meeting with our comms department on Friday, and so we can certainly make sure that that gets pushed out to like, what is it, the City Administrators Association, and then there's the County Administrators Associations. We can send it to those groups pretty easily. I can't remember what the official, but you know who I'm talking about. There's like the Cal sheriffs, but there's a city administrator.
League of Cities.
League of Cities, yes, thank you.
Well, I think it would be nice to
Yeah,
get
no,
it
and we'll
actually
make sure
directly in
we're
the
gonna-
hands of every mayor.
Yeah,
in the
we're going to
city.
make sure that, that this gets widely distributed, so if there's anybody else that you have ideas about who it should go to, please let us know. And even if it's not before Friday, we can certainly incorporate that into our outreach plan.
Yeah, and that would build on the stakeholder list that was disseminated and discussed in the subcommittee meetings that were held between this meeting and the September meeting. So if you review we can send that around again. And if we see
Great,
anything
great,
additional.
thank you.
And please, feel free to disseminate through your own organizations as well, or whatever your list serves.
Okay, great. So getting back to the report, because we are running short on time, and I know we're going to start to lose some board members. So we've had 3 recommendations so far, general recommendations. One was a framing recommendation brought forward by Tim and Sarah, and then secondly, a request to follow up on the reference to Sam Singnagwe, to make sure that that's verifiable data. And then, oh my goodness, I had a third in my head. Oh, to move the stop data section up. Those were the 3 recommendations so far. Are there other recommendations, general recommendations regarding the report?
Committee wanted to bring to the board. Should that wait till we're done with the general comments, or?
No, go ahead.
Okay, so one thing that we went back and forth on during our subcommittee meetings was making a recommendation to the legislature to remove the language and the admonition in the citizen complaint form that states that if you make a complaint that is false, you're subject to misdemeanor. It's Penal Code 148.6. And one thing that Sheriff Robinson and I discussed was my perspective was that anonymous complaints should be allowed, especially given the climate that we're in. Sheriff Robinson raised that there's a real concern about frivolous complaints sucking up officer resources. We spoke to the Inspector General of LA Police Department, and his recommendation was, well, he said that LA specifically allows anonymous complaints because he likes the bar to be as low as possible for people to be encouraged to come forward to make complaints, even given the concerns that were echoed by Sheriff Robinson about frivolous complaints sucking up resources. And one thing that he did bring up that I have before me now is that there's actually a federal court case right now that states that a police officer is not entitled to qualified immunity if he or she arrests someone for violating this section, and this could leave a police officer liable for damages and punitive damages at trial. So from a legal perspective, they've stopped putting that admonition in their form, and they allow anonymous complaints. So this is something that Sheriff Robinson and I wanted to bring to the board about whether we make a specific legislative recommendation to remove that language so as to potentially, number one, I mean, it sounds like there are some legal issues that are working their way in the federal courts right now, and also to encourage people to feel comfortable coming forward to make complaints, especially in the environment that we're in, where like or not even low income, but vulnerable communities are very afraid of identifying themselves, given all that's going on that I don't need to go into. So I wanted to open that up to hear what folks think.
And as I recall, you brought this recommendation to the last board meeting, and so it's on the agenda here for us to act on.
Oh, yeah, I was not at the last meeting.
Oh, okay. So, it was brought up as a recommendation from your committee for us to act on. So knowing now what it is that you wanted to bring up, if we could table that for a
Sure,
second,
yeah,
just so we can finish this off. Are there any other board comments on the draft report? Not at this time? No? Okay, so again, you are invited to send any recommendations to Kelsey. Line item recommendations are welcome, and send them directly to her, so we are in compliance with the Bagley-Keene.
Recommendations or just in, the Word document should be open to view red line edits and track change edits, so any form that's easiest for you all.
Okay, I do want to echo my colleagues in commending the DOJ staff for putting this together and for really capturing a lot of what we have been discussing in our committee and board meetings. So thank you so much for this tremendous work, especially you, Kelsey. Yay. All right, so then what we have left are the two items that have been brought up already. We'll take them in turn. One is a discussion of post-training funding. There was a recommendation in our last board meeting that we take this up and that we make a recommendation to, I guess this would be, I'm not sure what the protocol here is, if it's a recommendation to the Attorney General to make a recommendation to the governor, or if this can be made directly to the governor or to the legislature to increase funding for post to sufficient to cover the training necessary for AB 953.
So the recommendation would be a recommendation to the Attorney General to make a recommendation, whether appropriate to the governor or legislature.
Okay. I mean, that's the question. Is that the protocol?
The board can vote to make a recommendation to the legislature.
Directly to the legislature?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Because
But-
the Attorney General is a
Right.
member of the board, so
Uh-huh.
the board can make a recommendation to the legislature.
Okay, so with regard to funding, though, maybe it would go both to the governor and to the legislature, since it's the governor that will be pulling the budget together. And I think we had asked Post if they could come forward with a more concrete recommendation for what they need, and I don't know if anything ever came of that.
Question, when you say it's funding for AB 953, do you mean for Post to have money to train officers in how to fill out the forms, or for Post to be able to enhance their bias training curriculum?
Yeah, all of the above. There's no commensurate funding that went to them for training. They're under-resourced. It's come up through the committees that there's a tremendous need for additional funding for posts. I don't know what that funding dollar amount is. I don't know if anyone here does know. Kelsey, say?
I don't know off the top of my head.
Uh-huh.
I don't know the number specifically off the top of my head, but when I was having the conversation about it, it was making sure that Post is properly funded outside of AB 953, just making sure that it has the necessary funds for all the agencies to get all of the training that's being required of it through the state, whether it's AB 953, de-escalation, mental health, addiction, homeless, that type of stuff. Make sure that it's all encompassing. I think as a board, I think it would be a good recommendation because it's going to encompass AB 953 with all of that.
I agree with that, and maybe someone could hash out actual language, I guess, that we'd approve it December 10th, but I like the direction that you're going, and I don't think we necessarily have to have a dollar figure on that, right? If we're recommending to the governor and the legislature that they provide sufficient funding for Post to do all of those things.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. I think it would be a failure of our duty if we're not equally trying to think about how to effectively resource law enforcement to implement the changes that we're asking for. And we've heard that over and over for the last few years from law enforcement partners, not just on this board, but out in the community. So, to Tim's point as well, it doesn't necessarily have to be around a number, but I think us making that recommendation, and that I think could also create kind of a concrete way of both law enforcement and community working, coming into this next legislative season on something that's a mutually beneficial opportunity.
Yeah. So Commissioner, since you brought this up, is there a specific recommendation that you think we should take up?
How important it is that what we're doing, in order for it to, part of it to make it work, is the funding to provide the training, whether it be related to racial bias, whether it be mental illness training, all those things wrapped up in there.
Okay. Sound man. All right. In terms of procedure, how should we make this recommendation? The governor's going to be putting his budget together before our report comes out. So should we include some language in the report, some general language about the importance of supporting post-training as a component of the training recommendations? We could do it there. Should we or could we also convey through staff our recommendation to the governor who's putting together the budget now that we believe this is important?
I think we should send a letter. I think including in the recommendations is good, but we should send a letter on behalf of the board. I don't think sort of conveying it through DOJ staff, that's fine, but I think we're speaking as the board, and I think it's unique to have people across all the spectrum agreeing on one thing, at least. That would be nice to put out there.
So,
and I think somebody who knows more about post than I do could draft that.
Okay, so we have the constraints of Bagley-Keene, and so perhaps the recommendation could be for the co-chairs, myself and Sheriff Robinson, to draft a letter, work with DOJ staff to draft a letter and get it out.
Yeah, sounds good.
Or have the board, and the board can look at it at the next meeting on the 10th.
There's no hurry. The
Okay,
budget
great,
says
so we'll
start
bring
it.
that forward to the next meeting. But are we all in agreement that we should include those recommendations in the report as well? Yes. Okay, great.
I would again suggest, I think it would be really helpful to have some, if someone has specific language that they would like me to disseminate to the board so they can have an opportunity to review the specific language, to please send that along. Ryan or Commissioner.
Get it over.
Yeah, okay, all right. Great. Okay, so moving on.
Ryan knows exactly how much money he wants.
Okay, so Sahar, you brought up the recommendation for potential legislation. This was a recommendation coming out of your committee.
We were bringing it to a question to the board as to whether the board thinks it's appropriate for that admonition language that specifically requires a signature to be removed so that anonymous complaints can be recommended to be allowed.
I'll also suggest, highlight that Sheriff Robinson in the subcommittee meeting also suggested that a checkbox be added next to the signature that says it's anonymous, to make it a possibility, to make it sure that the public knows that they can submit it anonymously, is another option to address that. That was mentioned.
I think there's some.
So I have a question. Am I here?
Yeah.
So to the chiefs in the room and the commissioner, I remember 10 years ago, we stopped the 148.6. So if it's still on the statutes, I don't know that any agency in California is.
So there's a split of authority. The California Supreme Court has held that provision is constitutional. The Ninth Circuit has held that it's unconstitutional. So it is still on the form. I saw maybe about the time you're talking about, 2004 or so, that the police associations were recommending that agencies remove that language from their form so they didn't conflict with the federal law, because even though it was valid under state law, you could be federally liable in a lawsuit in federal court. The Ninth Circuit held that it violated First Amendment rights. So we do have a recommendation in this report that police agencies accept anonymous complaints. But to your point as to what to do with the statute, that's, I think that might be a bigger issue that we should if the board would like to discuss it and figure out what's the best way to go about it. I know it was on the agenda to discuss today, but I don't know if the people want to do more research on it or how you all want to handle that.
Well, maybe we can just test the temperature in the room and see where we're at. So your proposal and Sheriff Robinson's proposal is to amend the statute?
That was, I think Sheriff Robbins, do you recall exactly how this played out? I think we were saying that we wanted to see whether what the board thought about potentially making a legislative fix to this and removing it.
Exactly, and then the change that I had mentioned was one that Sheriff Robinson had brought up as another way to, address this issue of making sure that anyone who wants to submit an anonymous complaint is not deterred by the signature line, that you can check, so I think that was something that was brought up. Nothing was decided. I think it was meant to be brought up as the full board, but.
Okay, so it sounds like it's premature to take a decision on recommending legislation, and perhaps the question now simply is this something that we want to further explore to come up with a recommendation?
I think so.
Yes? Okay. All right. So do you want to make a motion, Sahar?
I'll make a motion that will explore this further, the issue of 148.6.
There's also an
Yeah.
Great.
So, but one question though, logistically, on our model form, are we going to include that box that says you can submit an anonymous complaint? Because that was the issue, is we're creating a model complaint form, and so can we remove that language if it's statutorily required?
That I'm not sure.
Right now, we are not including a model form in the report.
Okay,
Because
so
it just hasn't been vetted at this point, yeah.
Okay, so that's not going to happen in this report stage?
Until this can be vetted.
No, not for this. It's not included right now.
Yeah, I saw it was, and I didn't know if it was.
Sorry.
No, not a big deal.
Okay, so then
I'm just trying to
we're
figure
just left with the legislation.
Yeah.
And we have a motion, we have a second. Do we have any discussion?
May I make a friendly amendment, possibly? Yeah. To ask DOJ staff to find out through our 58 district attorneys how often this charge is filed,
Yeah,
just to understand.
yeah.
Great. So is that friendly amendment acceptable, Sahar?
Do we want to hear from I saw some quizzical looks
Wait,
right now.
I didn't hear the amendment.
Oh, okay.
It was to ask how often the 148.6 is charged throughout the state. I suspect it's going to be seldom, if zero at all.
You never know.
Okay, so I think the concern is that it's a deterrent to complaints, the
Yeah.
fact that it exists on the form to begin with, right?
Yeah,
Okay.
and I mean,
And I will say in the survey we did last year when we asked for complaint forms, I would say, I'm guessing, less than 50% of the forms had this signature, but some did.
yeah, so I mean, some still do have
Right.
it, so it's an issue.
It
Yeah.
depends on how you look at it, but it does seem like the fact that the Ninth Circuit is saying it's unconstitutional, though there's some criticism of that opinion, agencies aren't incorporating it, but there is more support to allow for anonymous complaints, and so therefore having the language may be a vestige. Although I do have to say that statute, Dr. Weber's had a 1953 where she amended the statute to talk about civilian complaints, and there was the opportunity to change that language, and it was not done at that time, and that was a couple of years ago.
Okay, but the recommendation right now is that we explore this further for a legislative fix. We have a motion, we have a second. All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? No. Okay.
I'll also say that in response to the conversations had at the subcommittee meetings, we've been doing a lot of this legal research behind it, and I'm happy to disseminate that to the board
Great.
It's a great issue.
Add more of it, but it's complicated, more complicated than we originally
Sure.
anticipated.
Great. So can we table this for next meeting, and can we ask, I know you're going to be very busy, but can we ask for whatever research you do have on this for the next meeting?
Yeah, we have it compiled, and we can see if we can answer Chief Swing's
Okay,
question as well. And add that
wonderful.
add
Okay.
that. We'll see.
All right, so with that, we are ready for public comment on the draft report, after which we can close out our meeting. Is there any public comment on the draft report? Yes, please come forward. And if you could keep your comments to 2 minutes, that would be much appreciated.
Good afternoon. My name is Michelle Wittig from the Santa Monica Coalition for Police Reform. I've been coming to these meetings since the inception of the board. I think that was in August of 2016. And I think you've heard my voice at some of the subcommittee meetings, although I don't often speak at the board meetings because I think it's important for the authentic voice of the community to be heard. But I have two suggestions. One has to do with legislation. I hope that the board will consider proposing that civilian oversight commissions be highly recommended in all communities and all jurisdictions of law enforcement in California. The second thing has to do with dissemination of the data and its analyses. Astronomy has its Neil deGrasse Tyson, a wonderful, authentic communicator of science. And I think that this board needs to have a cadre of trusted, community-based communicators, people who understand data, have the trust of both the law enforcement community and their own home communities, who have lived experience, perhaps as members of some of the most vulnerable communities affected by law enforcement, people who have deep knowledge of the methodology that you've used to collect the data and to analyze the data, people who have a strong commitment to reform, those who have the trust of both the law enforcement community and their communities themselves, and who have legitimacy. So if you can find a cadre of such people, they could appear on local city television programs, they could go out to town halls, and when the data are being analyzed and presented, they can communicate it effectively to the communities. But they'd have to be trusted by both law enforcement and the community members themselves. So I would suggest that you find such people and employ them to communicate the data, because it's the communities themselves that need to understand the data, not just law enforcement.
Thank you so much. Bobby?
No, not you. Yeah. So I heard you say something about how are these departments, I'm sorry, how are these departments are going to pay for these ITs and all these things. So I do policy work and I do comparisons all up and down the state of California. And one thing I've noticed about these budgets, thank you, Women's Policy Institute, that I know how to read a budget, that most of the cities and the sheriffs and the city police get at least up to 78% of the discretionary funds that come out. So I say, make a line item and pay and make sure this stuff is, because it's going on and you guys know it's been going on and now y'all want data for it. This is what it's for. Pay these IT people, pay these people. There's enough money in these discretionary funds. Pay these people. That machine doesn't stop printing.
Thank you. Did you want to make a comment, sir?
Just to the point of the last speaker, a few points of the board is going through, you're listening to your points. One is never assume just because large agencies are large that we have unlimited resources. The city of San Diego's budget deficit this year is approaching $74 million. So each department head has been asked to cut 3% of their budget, roughly, $15, $16 million. That's going to have an impact on us, and it's going to have an impact on all our operations, including how we perform the tasks and duties assigned to us under AB 953 and RIPA. In addition to that, in regards to different kinds of bias we've heard, when we listen to the board, we talk about implicit bias, we talk about explicit bias. What I would also ask this board is that you've had a number of experts appear before it. I'm actually one of the few people who probably watches your meeting online and try to take as much information from them. So I'm the person who watches. That being said, expert bias is also a real thing. When you have people who come up here, it's not just an obligation for each and every one of you to vet what I say and the information that I provide. I think it's also very important that the people that you have, whether in academia or other places, and experts to vet the information. I think the comment had come up regarding some of the information Brian had asked about, and Chief, you had mentioned it in regards to, raw data. That's important when somebody comes up here and mentions that, to make sure it's accurate. And people come up here with their own political agenda, even in certain areas outside of it, right? So, and then the last thing I would say is, information and disclosing information is a wonderful thing. You're each and every one of you on this board because you believe in what you're doing and you want to make a positive difference. And the more information that we provide, to the extent that it builds community trust and enhances relationships, that's really the goal, right, to go through this stuff. But also there's a balance to find. Some of the folks that we stop and some of the people that we contact have limited resources, especially in organized crime. To the extent that we release more information and provide more information, is it potential data mining involved where more information also leads to discovery of people who may be cooperating with us, the very people that we're trying to build trust with? And does that allow those people to be discovered? And I would just ask you that for more information, you find that balance and to make sure that we're securing both areas. Thank you.
Thank you. Terrence, last word? Host?
Man, ain't that somebody to come after? First and foremost, I would like to thank y'all for coming out. I thank y'all from the beginning for welcome to Riverside, and this is me probably saying goodbye. But all in all is that over the last 6 months, we've been having meetings with the police chief. And in doing so, we have brought community, clergy, and cops. We call it the Triple C, community, clergy, and cops. And we have showed y'all video at the actual meetings. And we use y'all as a model of people from the community, people from public safety positions, people who are clergy, getting together and working towards a policy change. So y'all have been a good example. We showed it at the video. And I just wanted to say thank you for that. And I also would like to thank y'all for making the recommendation that all police departments do principal policing, which is procedural justice and implicit bias trainings. I also commend that. And only thing that I would think it would be nice to add is if the same thing that y'all doing now is that y'all have a community component on it, especially in relationship to Module 4, where you can have the community members come out and be a part of this training. Because the whole thing about it is to bridge the gap, So with that said, again, thank y'all for coming out. Thank y'all for the work that y'all doing. I appreciate y'all, and y'all have a blessed day.
Thank you so much. So before we break, and I know everybody's rearing to go, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that the RIPA team at DOJ has received an award from the Attorney General, and it's for the work that they've done for the RIPA board, which has been tremendous. We've seen it, and Nancy left the room, but let's give them a round. Oh, there she is. She's hiding. All right. So well done. We couldn't do this work as a board without excellent staff, and we really appreciate everything that you do. Anything else that we need to cover?
I just also wanted to thank Councilmember Andy Melendres and Miguel Lujano for helping connect us to this beautiful location and for hosting us in Riverside. Thank you.
Wonderful.
I just had a follow-up question to one of the comments. And just sort of defer this, but I'm wondering for the folks who are on the Civilian Complaints Subcommittee, whether this issue of whether the board ought to recommend that every jurisdiction, every agency have some kind of civilian review board, whether that's been discussed, or whether the committee has a recommendation on that yet.
I think that
They
they
should
should
con- they
consider having civilian review boards.
I can look up the exact wording, but yes.
Great.
I don't know exactly.
Great.
Any closing comments from board members?
Preclusion from other outside analyses of the data, the raw data that we collect. In other words, I know we have an arm that's going to do an analysis of our data, but there have been a lot of comments about the cost of an analysis and the bias of an analysis. I would assume that there are a number of think tanks around the country, and including in this state, at Stanford University specifically. I don't know if Professor Eberhardt's on our board anymore or not, but she's done a lot of research in this field. People that have the wherewithal, the credentials, and the intelligence to do an unbiased analysis of our raw data. And so is our raw data going to be accessible to those kinds of research teams, schools, educational facilities, in addition to what we do in-house to sort of give it the balance that's been talked about here?
Yeah, so I think the short answer is yes. The department's working on a policy and a sort of a procedure for how folks will have access to that data. But there will be public access, there will be access for researchers. And I think also, just to sort of piggyback on kind of what you're asking, the Research Center also works closely with other external, academics that sort of help vet our work before it's sort of completed and ready for showtime. So hopefully that kind of answers that question. But yes, there's a process for that.
I think we should encourage that kind of focus on the information that we collect, and that we encourage other educational think tanks to look into the data that we have access to.
Yes, and these are all good questions for the year to come as we get that data in, right? We have a full year to go before we have a complete set of data.
But the full access, as Randy was saying, is built into the regulations, and they're developing a policy to, ensure that the data is treated as it should be in terms of confidentiality.
Oh, right. I'm not talking about disclosure of confidentiality. I'm talking about an analysis of data and hopefully recommendations from other sources about how to fix the problem of biased policing.
No, I think we're talking about the same thing. I'm just saying that the policy that Randy is talking about will ensure that the research have full access to the data, as opposed to the smaller subset that is going to be available through the Public Records Act requests. And that's the policy that they're developing, and they were going to work with researchers to get them that information so that they can do those broader studies.
And if I may interject here, but we've also already begun some of that stuff as well, in reaching out and encouraging people to, at least, obviously we don't have data yet, but Dr. Chance and I were just at the American Society for Criminology's annual conference a couple weeks ago, and during that we gave a presentation in which we were making researchers that were attending that conference aware of the type of data that is being collected and will continue to be collected in California, as well as kind of some of the timelines for when that data will then become available, so that the researchers that had gathered at this conference could begin, one, if they hadn't heard about it, if they're in another state or something and just weren't aware, could be aware of the type of data that would become available, and then also start making their plans for how they'd like to analyze the data once it does become available. So we've already begun that, and this is a plan to just keep on talking about that in the research community.
Great. Any other comments from board members? DOJ?
I just want to say I look forward to seeing you all again, either by video or hearing your voice on the telephone on December 10th at 9 a.m. It's a different start time. We're starting at 9, not 10. So I just want to make everybody aware so that we can have a quorum and get our business conducted.
Wonderful.
And I hope everyone had a really nice Thanksgiving, and I'm glad that you could all make it today.
Yeah.
Really appreciate your time.
Wonderful. Okay, with that, we are closed. Thank you so much. Safe journeys.